A client sent me this old handle off of a vintage Fender Tweed amp and wanted me to take a look at it and redo the stitching and maybe do something about this white paint or finish on the top layer. So I'm going to see what I can do and do a refurb on it one way or another. The first step is going to be to remove the stitching and take off this top layer of leather to see what I can do with it. So I'll just run my X-Acto knife around the top layer, which isn't even glued down, and cut through the stitching and remove the layer. So now that I've got that off, I'm just going to go through with some tweezers and remove each stitch. Now that that's cleaned up, I can attack this top layer and see what we're working with here. I've already tried some denatured alcohol and then stepped it up to some lacquer thinner on this paint, but none of it was really doing any good, so I'm going to go with this citrus strip paint remover and see if it can do anything. So I'll just do a little test spot and see if I get any results. After letting it sit for about 30-40 minutes, I'm going to see if I can scrape any of that paint off and if it's done anything, but it looks like it's done absolutely nothing. So I'll let it sit a little longer and come back, but I don't think this is the solution. Our plan B is just to replace the top piece of leather altogether. So I'm going to gauge this, and it looks like I need a 3-ounce leather for the replacement. I've got my 3-ounce vegetable tanned leather here to replace the top layer, and I'm just going to trace out the pattern roughly on the leather, and then I'll cut it out. Next, I need to dye this leather to match the original handle. So first I'm going to apply a layer of oil, which will even out the dye a little bit. And then I can come in and dye the leather to at least as close as I can get to the original color. After the dye has had a chance to dry off, I can apply another quick coat of oil and then some finish. And I'm using just a wax-based finish here. While I'm at it, I'll also clean off the bottom layer of the handle with some saddle soap. And I can also go back and pull out some of those little pieces of thread that I didn't get before. This original leather is pretty dried out as well, so I'm going to give it a light coat of oil. I've punched some holes for the mounting hardware, and now I need to think about uniting the new piece with the old original handle. Now, I don't think that any of these layers originally were glued together, but In order to make this work, I am going to apply a little bit of glue between the top layer and the old, just so that they're affixed properly for the sewing process. Now, I think if I want to come back and undo that later, it won't be too hard to do that because I'm only going to use a little bit of glue. With this contact cement, you want to apply a little bit, in this case, to both sides and wait for it to dry. And once it's tacky, you can affix them together. And in this case, it won't be permanent, but if I had used more glue, it would be a very permanent bond between the leather. Now that I've got the two layers together, I'm just going to massage them a little bit so that top layer conforms as best as it can to the shape of the handle underneath of it. I'm going to use this stitching chisel, which fits the holes nicely, to just punch through from the back of the old handle through the new layer. So I'll just go around one at a time, punching through, making my new holes. We wanted to replicate this chain stitching look that these vintage handles tend to have on the back. So normally I would do a saddle stitch, which is a 2-needle hand stitch where the thread loops back over itself in each stitch. But in order to get this kind of stitching pattern, I had to use just one needle and kind of go through each hole one at a time and loop back through the thread and then pull it tight, which turned out to be a pretty long process, especially because I had no idea how much thread I actually needed for this because I've never done this kind of stitch before. So I'm spending a lot of time just pulling the thread through, but in the end, it worked out pretty well. And even though I definitely had way too much thread, it looks good and really is exactly the same stitch pattern as on the originals. So by using all the original stitch holes, I've even replicated the kind of bad stitching that these handles had, where the stitch line just gets way too close to the edge of the leather. I'm going to sand back the overhang on the top layer of leather just so that it meets up with the original handle in a nice smooth transition. And I'll just give a light bevel to those edges so they're not sharp on top. A light sanding with some 400 grit paper will even out any inconsistencies left by any of the other tooling. I can then go in and dye the edges to a consistent color with the rest of the handle. Once the dye has dried, I can smooth the edges with a little bit of saddle soap. And finally, seal the edges. I'm very pleased with how this turned out in the end. I think it's almost indistinguishable from what an original handle would look like. including the weird stitching. The edges aren't perfect. All these things that make original Fender Tweed handles unique. And I'll show you a brand new Tweed style handle I just made that has all the modern features, neater stitching, better edge work, just better materials and workmanship altogether, if I do say so myself.